second video about the two colonial empires of France and Britain during the period 1870 to 1914. And in this new video, I will examine part 1b, which is entitled New Imperialism, an acceleration of colonization after the 1870s. To start with, just one remark about the term imperialism. It basically defines the will of a state to build an empire, but it has a wider meaning than colonialism precisely. It's more general. In fact, we often call imperialism the attitude of a country who tries to increase its domination over other regions of the world, even if it's not specifically by conquering some colonies. Okay, so for example, we may speak about the imperialism of the USA, a will to dominate, to control more areas, but which almost never took the shape of colonialism. Anyway, we are speaking about colonialism in this lesson, and we are speaking about this post-1870s period, which was a peak in the process by which the European powers took possession of many lands all over the world. And so my first question will be, why then? Why at that moment? In other words, we are going to deal with the factors of this acceleration of colonization. So among the reasons why more people in Britain or France felt like colonizing the rest of the world, one word must be said about what seems to be the most positive reason in a way. And it is true that there was in Britain or France, and in particular in Britain, a kind of desire for scientific discovery of new lands, of new flora, new fauna. And it's a fact that geography associations in Britain encouraged and funded explorations. It was notably the case of the Royal Geographical Society, which was very important and very rich at that moment in Britain, and which famously funded the expeditions of Dr. David Livingstone, which was quite a famous character in the last part of the 19th century, and a very good example of what is sometimes viewed as, a positive colonizer, even though it is a debatable phrase. The truth is that David Livingstone was a doctor, and he was also a strong Protestant believer, and so he wanted to act like a missionary in Africa, which means he wanted to convert more people to Christianity because he simply believed it was good, which is only an opinion, of course. And he was a character that became famous because he used to write down a diary about his explorations, and so the press in Britain, and not only in Britain actually, but in many countries, told the stories of the adventures of Dr. Livingstone. So he was the most famous figure of what we can call the explorator. And his personal objective was to spread what he called the 3 C's: civilization, Christianity, and commerce. One thing which is true about this kind of justification of colonization is that indeed somebody like Livingstone, and more generally the British, always said that one of their goals was to fight against slavery in Africa, because in fact slavery had been abolished in all British colonies since the 1830s. Okay, and well, that's an illustration of this, I would say, cultural or religious factor that existed. Just a a detail but which is quite famous. Livingstone was the first European to find these spots in Central Africa, these falls, which he of course named after his queen Victoria. And so that's Victoria Falls. These cultural factors and religious ones were totally dwarfed by the far most important economic and political goals of colonization. I have already talked about these economic and political goals in the previous video, but I would like to give another example of this economic objective of making money and becoming rich, something that we can call greed, which was, of course, the main motor of many colonizers. And there is no better example of this than this businessman, Cecil Rhodes, who became a very rich man in the industry of mining in South Africa. And Cecil Rhodes became a very ambitious man. He wanted always to find new deposits of minerals in the south of Africa. And at one point he became so ambitious that he became an active colonizer, followed by an army, and he took control of some lands which a bit later were named after himself. They were named Rhodesia. Long after they would become the African countries of Zimbabwe and Zambia. Okay, and he was the most famous example of a kind of frenzy for the discovery of new minerals in the south of Africa by European businessmen, and we call that wave the Diamond Rush of the 1870s. Just for the story, of course, the statue of Cecil Rhodes was present in many cities of the south of Africa, but recently in many places in Africa, the statues of Rhodes were dismantled, as it is shown here. I think this picture was taken in Cape Town, South Africa. So in any case, of course, the reason why European colonizers were so successful in that moment was the big role played by industrialization and capitalism, which had developed in Western Europe much faster than anywhere else in the world except the USA, and gave to these Western countries a real advance, a decisive gap in their level of technology and wealth and firepower, a big gap between them and the rest of the world. But I think one last factor that must be considered is some kind of a multiplier effect. One word about this illustration, on which you can see several heads of state or allegories that represent a regime. For example, you can see Marianne on the right, but you could also see Queen Victoria on the left and the Chancellor of Germany in the middle, just next to the Russian Tsar and a Japanese leader as well. And what this picture is about is more specifically the case of China, which is a country that did not totally collapse at that moment, but had to accept to open many of its cities to the greed of European merchants, because it was threatened by all these foreign powers. And so this is an episode that we call the Breakup of China, and which marked for China the beginning of what they called their century of humiliation. Anyway, I chose this image because I want to illustrate the fact that, contrary to the first part of the 19th century, where Britain was almost the only very active and successful country in colonization, by the last part of the 19th century, well, the other European powers, they started to enter the game. And Britain felt threatened by this. Britain felt particularly threatened by the rise of Germany in Europe. Germany's economic development was very impressive in the last decades of the 19th century. Britain was notably afraid of Germany's views on Africa. Britain was also afraid of the more active colonial policy of France. And so consequently, Britain accelerated its own expansion. So this process, this multiplier effect, led most European powers in a kind of frenzy of conquest. And so things accelerated really at the beginning of the 1880s, with in 1881, for instance, France creating a protectorate in Tunisia. A protectorate means a colony, but which was allowed to keep its local rulers as long as they remain loyal to colonial power. So that's a kind of, indirect colony in a way. The Germans and the British disliked that a lot, and this accelerated, for example, the British conquest of Egypt the year after, in 1882. For Britain, having control over Egypt was something very important, because Britain wanted to have control of the Suez Canal, which was a vital waterway between Europe and India, so essential to the British Empire. And at the same moment, France, which was already present in the south of Vietnam, in an area that was known in those days as Cochin China, then invaded the rest of the area that we today name Vietnam, but which in those days was named Indochina by the French. And so the very important conquest was the conquest of Tonkin in the north of modern Vietnam today. That was a conquest which was notably supported by Jules Ferry, with words and arguments that we will study in the next video. So yes, the frenzy was really taking off at that moment among European powers. One remark about this. This competition between nations of Europe who felt endangered by the growth of their neighbors. Okay, and so it was like a kind of virus. You see, everybody was afraid of everybody. This growing tension opened the way to a new form of nationalism. I'm talking about the idea here, the ideology. A nationalism that defined itself as the will to preserve one's nation's survival or one's nation's power against its enemies. So you see some kind of aggressive attitude towards the other nations. And the final result of this growing sense of nationalism among European countries would be the First World War a bit later, in 1914. The battleground will then be Europe itself. But before that, in the 1880s and 1890s, the battleground would be Africa. So this leads us to part 2, the Scramble for Africa. I put that expression between inverted commas because it's an extremely famous expression that could also be rephrased the rush on Africa. And that applies to 2 defining decades during which the European powers decided to play a kind of a violent monopoly game with the world as a battleground, and more specifically Africa. Why Africa? Well, because Africa was, according to the words of historian Niall Ferguson, which I quote again, Africa was the last blank sheet in the imperial atlas of the world. For the Europeans, the land of Africa was the last remaining area that could be taken over. It had not been taken over before, because in the past it used to look more dangerous than profitable. And suddenly it became the target of European powers who were all afraid that Africa would be won by their enemies before them. But the European leaders were not totally stupid, and that is the reason why a very important event took place in 1884-1885. That event was an international meeting called the Berlin Conference. It took place in Berlin because it was called by Chancellor Bismarck, the head of the German government of this new country that was Germany at the moment. So Bismarck initiated this meeting because he wanted the European countries to have their shares of Africa without triggering a war between one another. Okay. The goal was really to avoid wars between European countries. And so representatives of many European countries met in Berlin for a couple of months. And so Africa was more or less divided on a map, on a table, as if this continent had absolutely no sovereignty at all, which is in fact what most European countries used to think. This is how the text went. We'll not read it in its entirety, but I think that the first lines are interesting, because in the first lines of a text where decisions are made, you always have the motives that have led the signatories to make this agreement. And so here it went. In the name of God Almighty, so always reference to God, they were all among Christian countries. The signatories, so the countries that signed the paper, wishing, in a spirit of good and mutual accord, to regulate the conditions most favorable to the development of trade and civilization in certain regions of Africa, and to assure to all nations the advantages of free navigation on the two chief rivers of Africa flowing into the Atlantic Ocean. So two remarks about this first paragraph. Initially, the conference was to be only about West Africa, but in fact, the rules set during the conference applied to the entire continent. And in these first lines, of course, there is a word that you cannot read, because in diplomacy, you can't pronounce it. There is not the word conquest. You can't read that. Nobody would have dared to say, here are the rules for the conquest of Africa. No, the tone was much more hypocritical, which is the case of most diplomatic documents, actually. And so it talked about the regulation of the condition most favorable to the development of trade and civilization, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So you at the beginning, at the basis of colonialism, you have this hypocrisy that the European powers were not acting for their own interest, but for general principles like the development of trade and civilization. Of course, it was an hypocrisy. Being desirous, on the other hand, to obviate the misunderstanding and disputes which might in future arise from new acts of occupation on the coast of Africa. This one is a bit more explicit. It talks about occupation, so we must understand military occupation, and the real goal of the Berlin Conference is very clear, to avoid disputes, to avoid a war between European countries. Lastly, concerned at the same time as to the means of furthering the moral and material well-being of the native populations. Okay, that's the pretext. That is the very important line, not to talk about reality, but to talk about propaganda, communication. Of course, what was said was that the presence of the Europeans in Africa was aiming at improving the well-being of the native populations. This is a point on which there is a lot to say. We will talk about that in the next video. And so all these signatories have resolved, and they made a lot of decisions. They made a lot of decisions in order to permit free trade, navigation on the main rivers of Africa, to evoke some moral objectives like suppressing slavery, and more generally the goal of civilizing the natives, which mostly meant turn them into Christians, and which again is very, very problematic objective, and some rules for conquest. For example, the idea that conquest should happen from the coastline to the interior all the time, and the principle that occupation had to be effective. You had to be here, you had to station soldiers and an administration for a real occupation and administration of the territories you had conquered. And I have selected only one article that we can use with its exact words. In case a serious disagreement shall arise between any signatory powers of the present Act, or the powers which may become parties to it, these powers bind themselves, before appealing to arms, to have recourse to the mediation of one or more of the friendly powers. Okay, so that's the most important objective, to avoid wars between the European countries that were colonizing Africa. Almost nothing is said of Africa, in fact. Okay, and well, 20 years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, almost all of Africa was under European colonial control. This is something that we will see a bit later with the map. So the Berlin Conference aimed to maintain a kind of peace, but of course, the conquest of Africa was always, and by definition, violent. Military conquest did not happen without any resistance by the natives. That was logical because, as I said, taking control of another country which is inhabited is by definition a violent act. I will take two examples for Britain and two examples for France in order to illustrate that violence. The peak of British violence is probably the Battle of Omdurman on the 2nd of September 1898. It was a battle in which the British armies were commanded by a very important general called Lord Kitchener. I will mention it several times in this lesson and in the lesson about World War I. And their goal was to take control of the areas south of Egypt, so the Sudan. And on that day, in this battle, you had a British army on one side composed of 8,000 British soldiers and 17,000 Egyptian and Sudanese soldiers. And in fact, if you have a look at this illustration, which is not very realistic, but which has some meaning, you can see in the foreground on the left British soldiers. They are white and they have moustache. And in the background, behind the Union Jack flag, you can see some African soldiers commanded by a British officer. And this was the case of most, and my dog is barking actually, but that will provide some action in this video. I think it's all right now. What was I saying? Yeah, this structure of native soldiers fighting under the command of British officials is really the basic pattern of any colonial army. Okay. this picture is very interesting. In the background, you can see interesting details like a train being brought in by the British, a way to show that they were bringing civilization. And in the background, you can also see the British battleships, which, of course, provided an advantage, a huge advantage to the British. And on that picture, they seem to be fighting against an army of, savages, if these words mean something, of a very, very traditional African army fighting with very traditional and not very effective weapons. It is very caricatural in the way things are represented. But this incredible advance, technological advance of the British was real. Indeed, you had an army of 25,000 soldiers on the British side, as said. And on that day, they fought again 60,000 Africans and killed 10,000 in one day, losing only 47 men on the British side. So you see the totally imbalanced death toll of this battle. 10,000 dead on one side, 47 on the other side. The reason for that was this, the new British weapon, the machine gun, which was first designed by an engineer called Maxim, and that's the reason why it was nicknamed the Maxim gun in the early days. So you know that weapon, it was able to shoot hundreds of bullets in a minute, creating a wall that prevented any army from taking over. And I would like to illustrate that with a song that used to be sung by the British soldiers. It was adapted from a poem, but the adaptation is very provocative here. It's called Onward, Chartered Soldiers, onto heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the glorious tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with a Maxim gun. And it goes on. Tell the wretched natives, sinful are their hearts. Turn their heathen temples into spirit marts. And if to your teaching they will not succumb, give them another sermon with the Maxim gun. So this poem is interesting, I think, because it illustrates how conscious the British were of the violence they were using. And talking about violence, one event was particularly remembered in a bad way. There were two conflicts known as the Boer Wars. They were fought by the British, and the second of these wars was a kind of Vietnam War for the British Empire. What I mean is that, the Vietnam War was a war of the 20th century fought by the USA against Vietnam, a long war which surprisingly was extremely difficult for the most powerful army. And this is what happened to the British. The Boers were farmers of European origin. Actually, they were of Dutch origin. And they were there because before Britain, the Netherlands used to dominate the south of Africa. And so they were colonists. But they refused to fall under British rule at the end of the 19th century. And they wanted to have independent states, independent republics in the regions of Transvaal and Orange, as you can see on the map. And the British would not have it. And so it was a real war. I'm really talking about the second one here, which was extremely difficult for the British, with huge costs in lives, more than 45,000 dead during this war, huge cost in money, and because it was so hard, it created huge divisions at home in Britain. We mentioned that war when talking about British Home Affairs. The Boer Wars is often seen by historians as a kind of repetition in the musical or theatrical sense of the term, a rehearsal. This is the word I was looking for. A kind of rehearsal before World War I, in the sense that trenches were dug because the armies present here had now weapons that were really murderous. That would be the case in World War I, and warfare would be changed forever. Eventually the British won, but during this war, Commander Kitchener invented something that would be one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. In fact, in order to deal with the civilian population in the Boer republics, he decided to create prisons in the open air to park, to concentrate the civilians in camps. And in this situation, under the heavy and hot sun of South Africa, due to bad treatments, due to malnutrition, due to poor sanitation, 30,000 civilians, mostly women and children, died because of these decisions made by the British. In other words, we can say that at the very, very beginning of the 20th century, the British were the first European people inventing concentration camps. The French conquest was also violent. I would only take two examples. Well, the first of them is the conquest of Madagascar, which was really done thanks to a military superiority. And several times peoples in Madagascar took arms against the French, and each time the rebellions were cracked down in blood, as illustrated on this picture, where again you can see native African soldiers fighting under French command, as almost all colonial armies are. And another very famous, well, very striking, I would say, episode of the violence that colonization could trigger is the Voulet-Chanoine mission in 1898. So Voulet and Chanoine were two commanders whose mission was to lead some troops in order to find Lake Chad in the very center of Africa. And on their way to Lake Chad, this military column, perpetrated some of the most horrible war crimes that can be remembered in the history of the French army. As if they pushed the dirty sides of war to their peaks. Every village that was found was burnt, plundered, civilians massacred, with acts of cruelty, with hangings on the trees, with children roasted and eaten. Yes, rapes of all women, of course. In fact, these two military commanders went crazy. Or maybe they pushed war at their peak. I leave this to your own judgment. And so another officer, their superior officer, was sent to find them and restore command. He was called Lieutenant Colonel Club, and he found them. After witnessing all the crimes they had committed, he found them, and he was killed. He was killed because these two French commanders totally refused to obey orders. The story ended when Voulet, the leader of the mission, said after the killing of Colonel Club that he was not a Frenchman anymore, that he was a black king now, and that he wanted to create his own empire. And this is at this point his own soldiers who were mostly native Africans, killed him and Shanwan. And you can see their graves here on this picture from 1906. That's just an example, of course, but I think that's an interesting illustration of how essentially violent is colonial war, because it takes place in an environment which, for the soldiers, looked like a new exotic land, far from civilization. So that's the reason why I believe the violence of colonial wars was extremely high. Extremely high violence, but not between Europeans. I will illustrate this with the Fashoda incident. In 1898, again, there was a clash between a French army and a British army. The French army was expanding from west to east and led by Captain Marchand. It was a race to reach the south of the Nile River before the British. But the British claimed they had a kind of legitimacy to dominate the Nile Valley. That was their goal, to connect Egypt to South Africa, to have a long stripe of land under British domination. And Kitchener was leading this army. And Marchand arrived a bit before Kitchener in the village of Fashoda in Sudan in the autumn of 1898. But the British would not accept the French presence, and when the British arrived, the situation was on the brink of war. War was avoided because the British were much more powerful on the ground. And France felt humiliated by this incident and the agreement that followed. It is what is illustrated by the caricature on the right. Anyway, about Africa, as I said, these 2 decades, or maybe 3 decades, were the fastest remapping of any continent in the history of mankind. The borders that were created in Africa were all created by the Europeans, and largely during the Berlin Conference. And these borders did not disappear after African colonies became independent later during the 20th century. So that's an extremely important moment in history. If we try to summarize this map, I think it's important to note that Britain almost controlled a long stripe continuously stretching from Egypt to South Africa. That France was much more present in North and West Africa, plus the Congo and Madagascar. That a huge part of Congo became the private property of the King of Belgium, Leopold. A specific case, private property of the king. And Germany managed only to get a few lands in the south, what we call Namibia, in the east, around what is now Tanzania, I think, and Togo and Cameroon in Central and West Africa. So Germany was not very, very successful here. Anyway, that was the result of Scramble for Africa. It started with some diplomacy, but it was by definition a very violent act and a tragic but very important episode of world history.